This is the Leon Trotsky Revolutionary Newsletter and Podcast. I'm Connor Exum, and today we're with Matthew Ho again to talk about the rise of the paramilitary right-wing movement in the U.S. in regards to political parties and everything else. So I'm with Mr. Ho. It's good to see you again. Great to have you.
Good to see you, Connor. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, it's great. So I was telling my audience that you were a former Marine. What was your actual MOS?
I was a combat engineer.
Combat engineer. Okay,
yep.
So you built tunnels, fortifications.
I was always, the Marine Corps divided into three kind of sides of the Marine Corps. You've got the infantry side, the combat arms side, the division side, if you will. You've got the service support, which is logistics, supply, maintenance, and then you've got the air wing. And I was always with the division side, the combat arms side, always with the infantry. So we did a lot of fortifications. We also did a lot of, in Iraq, we did a lot of route clearance. You go out and look for the IEDs. We did a lot of cache sweeps. You go and look for where, Marines are out there with the metal detectors, looking for explosives as well as for hidden weapons. So always with the grunts, that kind of thing. Don't ask me to build you anything. I'm not very good with that wasn't what we did. Other guys did that stuff. We filled, if people know what HESCO are, that's the extent of my engineering knowledge, is being able to put dirt into a HESCO barrier.
But I'm sure you make a mean slit trench. But that gets me to my next point. I mean, because recently North Carolina was in the news because of attacks on the power grid.
Right.
That also happened right around the same time as an attack in Oregon and a possible another attack in South Carolina. And I was thinking that perhaps this is some form of, paramilitary group that's probing at weaknesses in the infrastructure.
It's possible, right? It could be some type of organized test, right? Let's see what happens if we do this, both in terms of what's the reaction going to be, whether it's the public reaction, the law enforcement reaction, how's the FBI going to handle this, right? What's the media going to say? How are our politicians going to react to this? And then the people who are affected by it, what is their response going to be? I mean, one of the interesting things you saw about acts of terror in, say, Iraq that were against critical infrastructure was that the people blamed the government. So even though the insurgencies knocked down power lines or did whatever they did, ultimately the people's anger seemed to go against the government because they were failing to protect, they were failing to provide, they were, ultimately was seen as an action where the government took the blame, the fault, the discontent, even though it was an insurgent group that was doing it. So kind of counterintuitive, so it could be that. It could be a test, or it could be, a case of copycats. Right. The one in North Carolina happens. And then they did the one in South Carolina because they saw it. I mean, we don't know at this point.
No, we don't know. And that's the interesting thing, is that we don't know. But we are seeing a very large rise in paramilitary training in the right.
Well, just to go back to that point that we don't know at this point, the fact that there's two things you can kind of look at it, right? One, maybe our law enforcement isn't as good as everyone portrays them to be. So that maybe our understanding of our particular federal law enforcement or FBI and their ability to use forensic and particularly signals type intelligence, capturing cell phone data, maybe it's not as sophisticated and as good because they haven't, right? There hasn't been the explanation hasn't come out, right? Or maybe it's because the perpetrators are quite adept, right? Yeah.
Or they could be going low tech.
Or they go low tech. Yeah. Yeah. No matter how you look at it, the more you peel at this. And I think a lot of us wish it was just a case of a couple of good old boys who took their guns out after they had too much to drink and shot up the transformer, right? I think a lot of us, I was really hoping that was going to be the case. I don't want to see anything like this, and doesn't look like that was the case.
No, it doesn't.
Since in North Carolina, it was against two substations, right? And it was well done. It was well executed. It wasn't like a couple of guys. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Beer cans and tire tracks everywhere.
Yep. And they had their Remington 570s with them and, just trying to shoot the moon. They hit the hit the substations or transformers or whatever. Yeah. So I think what we probably have, I guess, if I had to, you say, hey, what do you think this is? I think there's the potential for, I think copycat's very real. So it might not be a series or an organized thing, but copycats. But the other side of it, I would say, is that, it's a decentralized network where they are, okay, let's see what happens. If we do this, what comes from it? What can we learn from the reaction from
Well,
it?
that's what I thought immediately, was that it was a probing operation, that they were probing the response both from the government and the people, as you said, and also to see what occurred later on. Did it destabilize the region enough to do further attacks? Did they move resources somewhere that might have been the real primary target?
Right.
To guard power stations.
That's exactly right. That's the other thing you look at. I think you'd often look at, and my perspective is all a counterinsurgency perspective. So not a law enforcement perspective, but was the purpose of this to see what the secondary and tertiary effects would be. If we take down the power station, how long do the traffic lights go down for? How long does the cell network go down for? Does the police then have the ability? How do the police communicate if the cell network's down? Obviously the radios, but just kind of explaining what the thought process would be to see how this unfolds.
To jam.
What's that?
If you're a very sophisticated unit, the radios are easier to jam than the cell towers.
Oh, right. Exactly. So what the prime purpose of this may not have been to knock out power for a few days and make people very uncomfortable. And it did. They did it during a cold period. It wasn't like North Carolina just last week. We had 70-degree weather. They could have done it then. Would have been nice, but they chose to do it during a time when it was quite cold, actually, for North Carolina. Yeah. So, there's all kinds of interesting aspects to this that you can see from, again, going back to what I learned and saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, how a paramilitary organization here would replicate or reflect that.
And we can't deny that a lot of these paramilitary units have people with extensive experience in an insurgency combat situation.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Good percentage of the men and women who make up a lot of these groups have military experience. And that was one of the things that has been warned about for quite a while now, for going on for more than 30 years. That was one of the things from the Oklahoma City bombings, was this idea that these types of groups, and if people remember in the 90s, you had these militias proliferate. Yes. They probably had existed before, but now they had the attention and the notoriety. But was the idea that many of them came out of the military, but a lot of them also went into the military with these beliefs intact. And that what they saw in the military was the opportunity to get the training, to get the education, the skills, the knowledge. And certainly there's no better way if you want to create some type of insurgent force, if you want to have some type of than to go to Iraq and participate, to go to Afghanistan, participate, to go to Syria and participate in a way where you could observe and, well, not just observe, but be involved, right? And
at all levels.
At all levels, right? Exactly. Understand,
and that's the real issue I think we're seeing. How many times do we see paramilitary-like units roll into towns when they have a drag show?
Right.
That's not normal. That's not a normal protest. You don't show up looking like the essay out of 1938, unless you're pretty committed to something that's not good.
Well, there's that's one of the things that bothered me, seeing a Proud Boy group in person back in early October, late September. I was at a Pride festival here in North Carolina, and seeing the Proud Boy members, and not a lot of them, but a good amount, 10 to 15 of them were there, but how disciplined they were and how organized they were, and the structure that was apparent just from observing them. And they were all kitted out, they're black and gold, and they had their flags, and they weren't being jerks. They were standing there and they weren't taunting, they weren't yelling, they weren't being abusive. They were just standing there with their signs. And the organization that you kind of see that was filling them out, and the understanding then of who these men were, it was all men.
Mhm.
And you recognize them. I recognize them from the Marine Corps guys, things I saw working with the Army.
Mhm.
This willingness to do violence.
Mhm.
So they were disciplined, they were organized, they were not going to do anything to cause problems at the Pride event other than to be there and to have their presence known. But you could also tell that with the leadership that they seemed to have, or with the right leadership, they didn't have it, they would do violence right away. That
Yes.
they would turn on that and they would do violence in an efficient and organized manner, which is very dangerous. That's much scarier, right, than a
Yeah.
bunch of yahoos who are yelling and just taunting and everything else. That wouldn't have bothered me as much as I saw with how disciplined these guys were and how efficient, I think, or organized their violence would be.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the chaos factor wouldn't be there with
Right.
them. They would be primed. They would have their targets picked out, and they would eliminate them in a very efficient manner because that's what they've been trained to do.
Right, and what I saw too with that, what you see with them as well, is you see a reason for being,
Hmm.
right? One, they're dressed similar, they got their uniforms on, and they got an esprit de corps. They've got a
Hmm.
brotherhood that is there, right? Very important, that type
Yeah.
of morale that exists because of such a thing. But they've got a reason for being. They are there opposing a fundamental evil or wrong.
Hmm.
They were opposing the Pride Festival because it was dangerous. It was threatening to them and their community. That's how they saw it. I disagree, of course, but that's so you have that organization, you have that esprit de corps,
Hmm.
you have that reason to right, that reason for
Oh
being, that
yeah.
purpose. And then if you have the discipline and you have the organization, the structure, and you have a leadership that can not just motivate, but also have kind of a strategic vision and purpose behind what they're doing. Now you start to get into areas where this is really dangerous. And so, like what we were just discussing before about what could these power station attacks be, then that starts to lead much more credence to this idea that there was something organized going on, that there was something deeper than just trying to turn off the power for a couple days,
Hmm.
that there was something more that we really should be concerned about. And of course, we see this throughout our political landscape right now, right? And
Well,
have for a while.
we have, yes, but I mean, but it's gotten worse over the last couple of years. I mean, we had, and I think it goes all the way back to almost the hysteria in the mid 2010s with the Prepper Society.
Yeah.
I mean, but a lot of those guys again were military,
Right.
former military, and it all rolls in. They are looking for a catastrophe to battle at this point,
Yes. Yeah.
and whether
Yeah.
they have
A
to make
reason.
it,
Yeah.
yeah, whether they
A
have,
reason for a meaning. A
yeah,
meaning.
whether
Yeah.
they have to make it or it comes naturally, they're ready for it. And I think we're at the phase where it didn't come naturally. The big decline didn't hit. 2012 was a bust for them. Such a shame. And now they have to make it. Yeah,
Right. I forgot about the whole 2012 thing. There was that movie.
there was. Once it gets a Roland Emmerich movie, you know it's over.
um, but yeah, this is, and it's something that has been going on, as we were saying, for quite a while.
At
And
least 50 years since Vietnam, beginning of
yeah,
Vietnam.
and what you get with that is you get a depth to it then, right? You
Mhm.
get organizations that have real structure behind them. You've had a chance for leadership to not just appear, but to solidify
Mhm.
and become legitimate leadership, right? Oh, Tom is the leader of our militia here. That guy's solid. He's been doing this. Or, I
Mhm.
mean, people who've kind of earned their place and earned the respect. This is where I think people who look at this stuff and understand it, and you see where it's heading and how it's been built. I mean, it's coming to a point,
Mhm.
right? It's coming to a point, and where does that point thrust itself into, and what does that then expand? What then expands from that? I don't think this is just speculation for the sake of hey, this is kind of neat to talk about. This kind of ties into what we saw happen in Iraq and Afghanistan. Hey, January 6th, the 2-year anniversary was just a couple of days ago. I mean, yeah, all that's true. However, there is a lot of foundation to this that, as you said, going back to this, the Vietnam War, that provides an edifice that is undeniable. In terms of a lot of different things like leadership, organization, resources, plans. The other thing too, when you have these movements, I feel that haven't gotten to where they see themselves losing. Right. They see themselves losing. Trump was a win, that kind of thing. But then the socialist Joe Biden took over. And of course, that was on top of the anathema that was the Obama administration, which anyone listening to this podcast, obviously, is oh my God, that's an anathema to these guys. You couldn't get a bigger backer of Wall Street in the fossil fuel industry than Barack Obama. True. But for these people, it was a huge loss. And the fact that you now have, say, one of their things that they hate so much, these drag queen brunches, these drag queen storybook hours. I mean, they see that as a tipping point has been passed, that they're on their heels. And so if you have decades where people have put the time in and the work in, and they haven't achieved the results that they want, and they feel that they're losing, well, that just allows for the more extreme solutions to be given much more credence. Okay, maybe it's not time. Maybe it is now time. I know you said 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it wasn't time yet to break out the rifles, right? It wasn't time yet to commit violence. But when's the time going to be? We've tried it this way. It's not working. We're losing. Look, my local bookstore just had a drag queen there. My local library just had one. How much more are we going to have to take? And
that's another issue. Geographically, right? I mean, these people tend to push themselves out to the extremes, but now the extremes, due to the pandemic, have come closer to them.
Yes.
And that's a huge problem. They see their safe neighborhoods that were once, all white and all one class have now become these mixed neighborhoods with Airbnbs that just let anybody in that they don't really trust or like. And next thing you know, you've got drag queens down at the local grocery store, and it just sets them off.
That's exactly right. And so where I read the Pride Festival I was at, where the Proud Boys were at, was in Hickory, North Carolina. Which
I know exactly where that is.
Okay, yeah. And so people who don't know, Hickory is about an hour and a half north of Charlotte, and people in Hickory will now tell you that Hickory, which is in the foothills of the North Carolina mountains, kind of like a gateway into the mountains, and beautiful, fantastic place to live. It has become, though, a suburb of Charlotte in many ways, even though it is so far away. That's the expansion of Charlotte into like this massive metropolitan area has had its effect on places like Hickory. And you talk to the folks who've been involved with the Pride Festival out there for a number of years, they'll tell you, I don't know how far back when they first started it, not that long ago, 7 or 8 years ago, maybe, it was a handful of them with some signs. And now there's a green space, a green area, kind of middle of Hickory, and public libraries right there, and everything else, and college is there, and the whole thing is taken up by the Pride Festival with all the accoutrements that come with Pride, right? Flags and tents and everything, right? So you can see how, just like you were saying, Connor, like this idea, and we've been saying that you're losing, and the most extreme things, the things that are the most scary to these people and horrendous, and that are the opposition to their way of life, are showing up in their towns, right? And so certainly, we have where I live here in Wake Forest, which has about 55,000 people now. 20 years ago, we had 7,000 people here. I guarantee you there was no drag queen storytelling at the library that was going on here. So people they see, as just as you said, their way of life being encroached upon by these extreme elements.
Yes, that exactly. And it's also a generational thing now. I mean, this movement has been around for so long, almost 5 decades, this paramilitary movement. You have kids of kids that are in it, and when you get those generations, it becomes more extreme as the generations move on.
There's I saw this with the Afghan insurgency, with what became the Taliban, but had its roots stretching back. Certainly, I think you could see this with the Vietnamese insurgency, which stretch back decades, right? Where you have it's a family affair, but there is that pride, that sense of entitlement and sense of being involved with something like that, where this is your heritage, this is your legacy, this makes you the person you are. That you're. I mean, I have that with my life because my family was involved with the IRA in Tipperary. My grandmother was from when she was a girl. She grew up during the Civil War, and then during the Revolution and the Civil War, and her house was a safe house, her uncle, I mean, on and on and on, all these things, and there's a sense of pride with that. Like, this is my legacy, this is my heritage, this is where I come from. So you can see that with these paramilitary groups as well. Again, with the Afghans, you talk to the insurgents, or you could have this feel that my father fought, my grandfather fought. Again, with the Vietnamese, my father fought, my grandfather fought. And here's the obligation as well. Okay, my father, my grandfather started with this, my father, but as you said, with the extremism though, and what did they accomplish? And we're losing. And so, it allows for more of the violent methods to become more acceptable, because that's what seems to be needed. That's what they say. Oh, okay, we've tried that. When's it time for the violence?
And that is very true. I think everything is true. I didn't realize you were Irish.
Yeah, my grandmother was born in 1909 in Tipperary, and she came over here in 19. What's that?
So just before the Easter Rebellion.
Yeah, that was 1916. So she was a young girl, and her family was all involved. Our family was members of the Third Tipperary Brigade. Tipperary was notorious. It was a place where the British garrisons were basically locked in their garrisons because the IRA and controlled the countryside. I mean, and she came over here in 1929, so she lived through all that,
Right.
And yeah.
Can't say I have any of that in my history. My grandfather just worked with the Free French, trained them during World War II.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And I was a Marine myself.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Nah, yeah. Well, I had a heart problem, and I was given a medical discharge before I could finish all my training.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, I finished my first part, right? I was in the reserves. And as you know, in the reserves, you have to do whatever's your reserve station. So I was a full loadmaster in a C-130. And then when I went to college, I was still in the reserves, and I was training to do tanks.
Okay.
The 4th Battalion Echo Company down in what used to be at Fort Knox. And so then I was, passed out in a tank one hot day, and I got kicked out.
Oh God, man! And now the Marine Corps doesn't even have tanks. All the tanks.
I know. I don't understand that.
Well, I think one of the if you look at the decision to get rid of tanks in the Marine Corps, not to get too nerdy about this stuff, was based upon the Marine Corps' desire to have its own doctrine and do its own thing. It didn't. When I was in the Marine Corps in the late 90s, colonels and generals would swear up and down we would never repeat Vietnam again. Many of them have been in Vietnam. And so they say, well, we'll never do that again. And of course, we did 2 of them within a couple of years. But they also, doctrinally, this is not what the Marine Corps is about. We're not supposed to be an army and occupation. We're not supposed to be in these type of prolonged campaigns. That's not the purpose of the Marine Corps, and that's not how we're fitted out. We don't have a logistics tail for that kind of thing, on and on and on. So I think some of it had to do with trying to get back to some form of doctrine that was substantially different from the Army. And tanks, of course, although tanks were very important in our counterinsurgent fight in a lot of ways. But the other thing, too, is I think in the summer of 2020, when Azerbaijan, using those Turkish drones, just utterly decimated the Armenian army, the decision to get rid of tanks, I think, had already been made by the Marine Corps, but that solidified the decision. That seeing what the drones did to the tanks, how they just absolutely cut the tanks to pieces with their drones. And I think what we see now with how some of the warfare, some of what's occurring in Ukraine, I think, helps to with that type of understanding that if, your tanks are able to be seen, they're able to be killed. And the Marine Corps, I think, doctrinally does not want to be in a fight where they're going to be in circumstances like that. So I think there's a lot of things that went into it, but one was just the evolving nature of the technology.
I don't know. I'm still pretty partial to them.
Oh, I mean, there's.
I think that those two wars, you're seeing two combat. I mean, obviously, the Armenians didn't have air superiority like we usually gain within the first week.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how many drones would be flying around in a war with us with air superiority? And not too many.
I don't know. You know, and this thing moves so quickly. How quickly the technology advances every 6 months or so, and the counters to the countermeasures, and the ability to use electronic countermeasures, is all those types of things. I don't really know enough about the state of it in Ukraine right now, I guess, to speak adequately to that. But certainly the advantage that tanks have in the place, say like Iraq, where we use them quite a bit. We didn't have very many of them, but their ability, particularly with, they had 3 machine guns on them, plus the big 120 millimeter gun. I mean, that was when I was in Iraq, my second time in our regiment, I would bet our tanks killed more people than anyone else did.
Probably. I mean,
because they're very effective, and they don't, when they shoot their machine guns, those machine guns don't miss, because they're basically, it's very advanced optics, computer type. Yeah. So yeah, it's, the tanks, I think, have a place, and certainly the Army loves their tanks, and Ukraine and Russia give the Army a reason to have tanks. And, the Army added 2 brigades worth of armored vehicles over the last 3 or 4 years. You can't have that unless you have an adversary like Russia, and that's what they want. They want that adversary, because that allows for them to have the doctrine that they want. That allows for them to have the war that they fantasize about.
That is true. But I mean, I would say that the Ukrainian war is almost going back I would say it's going back pre-World War I, the tactics in some cases.
You see some of the videos and the photos, and yeah, if you were to take those soldiers out and Photoshop in soldiers from the First World War,
maybe even the Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, you would have, it's the same type of thing that's happening here, and you're seeing the Russians, with the areas that they've taken in Ukraine, really fortifying those areas, building like kind of a modern Maginot Line, right? These massive fortifications, because I think what you have with the evolution of technology and warfare, it's like, I don't know if you ever read Joseph Haldeman's The Forever War.
Yes.
Right. And they get to the point where they're finally back fighting each other with spears and shields, because that's where the technology has taken them to, or I guess in Dune, right, where they wear the armor and you have to have a blade and force it through, because a gun or a laser beam or whatever wouldn't
create a nuclear explosion.
Yeah. The technology has gotten to that point where you're back at the very simplest basic levels, because that's what works. So I mean, but that's one of the things about the Ukraine war right now is it's so hard to get good information.
Oh, it is.
Right. It's really hard.
It is. I haven't seen too much good reporting on it either way. It's mostly propaganda.
Right. It is. I try to read sources from both sides, whether they be Ukrainian, Western, NATO, American sources, and then Russian sources. And then I try and kind of mentally construct a Venn diagram, and where they overlap may be what's actually happening, because
what seems to be overlapping to me is that both sides are having massive logistic problems and can't force the other side into a position where they can really push them out of the country.
Yeah, I think it's this is a deadlock and a stalemate. I think what surprised so many people is the depth of the Russian economy. How well prepared the Russians were for this in terms of their manufacturing, in terms of their resources. I mean, not this time, 11 months ago, as the sanctions were being introduced, or like 10 months ago, whenever that was.
They were going to cripple them overnight.
Right, exactly.
through all the
And it
predictions.
kind of made sense in some ways. I think a lot of us looked at the history of sanctions and said, it's not going to work. It hasn't worked in Cuba, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But then there are other aspects of it that you said, okay, well, it may have effects, say, on their domestic manufacturing. How are they going to get spare parts? You know, and well, lo and behold, they've got their own base for that. As well as, too, guess what? Nations like China and India are not going along with the sanctions. So
That was my issue. I always thought that China and India were going to be well too positioned to not take advantage of it at this point.
right, yeah, that's very much in the missteps here, the lack of foresight, the lack of people in DC and London to think these things through, or to have a clear understanding of what they're involved with, who they're involved with, what the likely courses of action were going to be. Why anyone thought the Chinese or the Indians or anyone, the Iranians, the Turks, whoever, were going to go along with the U.S. I don't. Why? Why would you think that was going to be the case?
I didn't.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
At the very least, how will you not expect a country like, say, Turkey to hedge? And it turns out the Turks have done more than hedge. They've you know, I forget what the percentage is, but they've drastically, you know, done a lot more trade with Russia, brought in a lot more Russian oil and gas, like that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, I think that's been a surprise.
Why wouldn't Turkey? They have had a huge inflation problem for about 3 years now.
Yeah,
Turkey. So they need to get that cheap oil in for their own survival on the political side. I mean, you have cheap energy, and then people overlook all the other problems you're having usually.
That's exactly right. As well as you know, the proximities of things. We in the United States, we want to put everything to its own box, and we somehow want to say that even though we've been button chests with Russia, say in Syria for years now, and the Syrian, you know, trying to overthrow their ally there and everything else, we want to put that in a different box. And we want to say that's not connected to all this somehow, you know. And then so we kind of we don't see how what the Turks are doing with the Russians has a lot to do with their neighbor Syria, you know. You know, kind of like that. Why is it so hard for us to understand in the U.S., and I say us, our leadership, to get that type of intersection, to understand those relationships, to understand how one thing affects another. But we want to put them all in boxes. We want to put them all in their own compartments. And I think that helps us understand when they act that way, our leaders, and they view things that way. I think it makes it a little bit easier to understand how they're so wrong so often, and just fail to do the necessary. Okay, if A happens and B happens, then what's C going to be? It seems like that type of calculus is never present in their decision making.
Well, I think it is, but it's very limited. And I think the one thing is that, especially in the Syrian case and Turkey's case, they never take into account the Kurdish problem. You can't deny that Turkey's trying to isolate the Kurds over in the very eastern part of the country. Syria is trying to keep them out, and you know that tends to make you natural allies with Russia, who is trying to do pretty much the same project you're doing, except over in the Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, the desire to just want this all to be simple, and then of course, like anything else, so much of our political leadership's decision making, their calculus is domestic based. Yeah, exactly. Votes, right? Yeah. So I mean, this type of stuff is, it's better just for their sake, just to vilify an adversary, have that external threat, whether it be Russia for the Democrats or China for the Republicans. You know, I think most of the Republicans that are opposed to aid to Ukraine, they don't have an issue with the war, or an issue with, you know, the geopolitics of it or whatever it may be. It's that we're giving it to the wrong people. This is the wrong war. We should be giving all that $112 billion should be going to the Taiwanese, not to the Ukrainians, you know.
Well, they're going to get that pretty soon, I think.
I think so too.
I mean, they look like they want to take back Taiwan before it fully solidifies the idea that they're a free nation in people's minds.
Yeah, I don't know what, you know, I think that the magnitude of something like that, cross straits, crossing like that, seas. I mean, certainly there's ways you would do it other than like a D-Day style invasion, but the magnitude of it, I think, is so massive that I think like a traditional idea of a conquest is something that's out of the picture. But I think you have other options for the Chinese. And so, yes, I certainly think that the Chinese leadership is very interested, at the very least, reducing Taiwan and their presence around the world. If they can't eventually make them fully under the wing, fully under the flag.
Well, I think well, I mean, the other classic one is just a giant naval blockade that strangles you. I mean,
Yeah.
they can certainly do that one. Restrict trade, make it so hard to trade,
right?
That no one wants to bother sending freighters over there because they get stopped all the time by the Chinese, and you have to spend all this extra money, and then it becomes useless to them.
Right. You have this idea of basically they start to treat Taiwan as the United States has treated Cuba for 60 some odd years, right? And even if most of the world doesn't go along with it, even if, like it happened again a few weeks ago, every nation but Israel and the US voted against the American blockade of Cuba, it's still going to have an effect. It's still going to have a deteriorating, devolving, destructive effect on Taiwan. But I think that what you have there is that just ends up making the Taiwanese resolve even greater. I mean, I think that's the great lesson, right, from the U.S. blockade of Cuba, is that it hasn't weakened the Cuban resolve at all. If anything, it gives them a reason, right? Getting back now, we're talking about the paramilitary.
Yeah, it definitely has
a reason.
It definitely has. But I think that in the case with the Taiwanese, they're so much closer and so much more their economy requires much more interaction with China. So if they can push away the rest of the world and force them to only interact with China, they've de facto taken away their freedom.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you on that.
You just weigh them out, and then by the time you can just start electing people that are pro-Chinese. I mean, they have a pro-Chinese segment of the country already. I have a Chinese aunt who lives, ironically, in Wake Forest.
Oh, really? No kidding.
Yeah. She's over in Taiwan right now.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think too, you also have the aspect as China grows and becomes more sophisticated, in terms of its diplomatic presence and certainly its economic presence. It's there. But as its diplomatic presence grows and becomes more significant, I think you then have the ability for the Chinese to play what the United States has done for decades of us or them. You got to choose. You're either trading with us or you're trading with Taiwan. And I think that really then puts a lot of nations, because of the relationship to the Chinese economy that are dependent on it in however many different ways. All right, what are we going to do here? I mean, you would like to think that there are cooler heads in both nations that would be willing to let this simmer and eventually cool down to the point where we have some type of relationship between China and China and Taiwan, where, there is no more difference and no one cares, which I think is something entirely possible to happen if you give it the time, but there's so much political capital to be made from opposing an adversary that on both sides, I don't think there's any chance of that, going forward for decades, or maybe I should say at least a decade, because it's such good political capital for both sides. I mean, look, here in the U.S., it's such hay for the Republicans, China, right? And I was just thinking about this earlier. I remember being at a thing in 2009 where you had all these people in D.C. talking about we need to get out of Afghanistan, think tank people, former military, politicians, whoever. And the I remember the argument a couple times that was being made was it's distracting us from China. It's distracting us from China. And of course, that's right. Remember when the Bush administration comes in 2001, January 2001, that's Condi Rice's line. It's about China, Al Qaeda. We're not concerned about Al Qaeda. We're concerned about, and one of the things was China.
Right. I mean, I'm surprised he didn't put them on the axis of evil, actually. I mean, he picked out other nations that didn't have anything. North Korea had nothing to do with it.
Right, exactly.
But that was only because he couldn't really say China without having a huge blowback at that time. So they had to build up to that point where they could openly start, saying that China's the big problem that we have to worry about.
Right.
And that's taken a decade.
I think too, it's been at that point too, going back 21 years or however long that's been since 9/11, with the Chinese, American corporations still, I think, had their say in China. I think they've lost a lot of their leverage in China, and I think that begins in the 90s, of course. But I mean, this construction of the U.S. bashing of China for human rights, which I'm not supporting the Chinese government in any way, right? But I think that's tied to the loss of leverage by American corporations and financial institutions in China. So as the Americans lose that business leverage, that fiscal leverage, the cries of, hey, the Chinese are doing awful things to their people rise. And
I think there's a direct relationship.
What's that?
I said I think there's a direct relationship between those two ideas.
Yeah. And so I think 20 years ago, the U.S. financial and corporate interests in China still had a much greater degree of leverage over the Chinese government and in the Chinese economy than they do now. Right. So I don't think that was at that point deciding to invade Iraq. And then, of course, we're going to remake the whole Middle East. And I mean, because I can tell you, I ran into people in 2004 even in Iraq and Baghdad at the when CPA, the Coalition for Personal Authority, was winding down. So the true believers were there. This was all staffed with neocons, and who'd be like, it hasn't gone the way we planned, but we're actually figuring it out now. And we just really the next big question is going to be, do we go right or left? Right, in the sense of like, do we go into Iran or do we go into Syria? And I mean, those thoughts are there. So I think the Bush administration at that point had its focus on remaking, fulfilling that PNAC, fantasy of remaking the Middle East, democratizing the world, civilizing those people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And we see how that was panned out for us. A lot of money spent, not too much in the way of positive results.
No, I mean, that amounts of money are just unfathomable, right? $14 trillion on the Pentagon from 2001 to 2021, including the wars. Only $2 trillion of that was directly for the wars. I know. So $14 trillion, $12 trillion went to the Pentagon in non-direct spending on, in not directly for the wars. I mean, like, it's just massive.
How many studies did they, top secret studies have they commissioned at $15 million or more a pop to tell them the same thing? The war's not working.
I had a girlfriend a number of years ago who worked for one of those
Rand company.
She worked for Booz Allen, one of the Beltway bandits, one of the consulting firms there that they don't get as much attention as Lockheed and Raytheon, but they're the ones that enable all these things because they are the firms that provide the personnel. These are the firms that staff out the Pentagon, the CIA, the State
all the
Department.
pencil pushers.
Right, exactly. With all the bureaucrats, the additional staff. I mean, I think the Department of Defense has over 450,000 contractors working for it. I mean, and some of them are people who are fixing engines, right, and doing things like that. But a lot of them wearing suit and ties, going into office buildings, making policy, basically. And but I remember her telling me about this, and she was a contracting person, so she did her contracts, right? And the one contract that came across, and she was like, "This doesn't make any sense to me." And basically, what it was a contract that Booz Allen had won to look at the Air Force's air war in the Balkans I think it was the Kosovo campaign they were looking at. And, she's like, this makes no sense. They have all the information. They're literally just hiring us to look at their information and tell them what their information says. I mean, that's the whole line about a consultant, right? Someone who looks at your watch and tells you what time it is. I mean, that's what so much of that policy work in DC that's dominated by these companies like Booz Allen does. It's so I guarantee you there are plenty of studies being conducted out there, Connor, for 10, 15, 20, $25 million, however much, where they've got a bunch of people telling the government stuff it already knows.
Those, and I mean, then you see studies that come out, right? And it's always some really crazy study that they let leak out, like the one about the ATIP program. The UFO program.
Which program? I'm not
ATIP,
sure.
2017, the ATIP program.
You have to remind me.
That was the UFO program. That was
okay, yeah.
Because that covers you for all the really bad ones that tell all the really bad stuff. This is the one you put out, and everyone goes, "Oh God, they're doing crazy stuff out there," and then they don't look too carefully at the fact that you got like another study that finally had to release that was like about like how many kids we blew up or poisoned by accident with
there's also
depleted uranium.
Yeah, they'll shut studies down when it doesn't go the way they want. So a number of years ago, I don't know if it was DOD or the Department of the Army or someone did start contracting someone out to do studies on explosive blast pressure and how that was affecting brains. When our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, something blows up near them, how does it affect the brain? And a lot of us have traumatic brain injuries from that, including myself. And so they had these pressure gauges they put on the soldiers and everything else. And what they found was that a lot of the blast pressure that was affecting soldiers' brains were coming from our own weapons.
Yeah.
And when that
shoulder-launched weapons.
Yeah. And when that kind of became clear, because that's not what the Department of Defense wants to be known, that our own weapons are injuring our own soldiers, they shut the study down. Right. I think the special operations guys still carried it on in some way, but the general army shut it down, because we don't like the results. We're just going to close this thing out. We don't need people knowing this stuff about us. So let's just shut it down.
What was it? I mean, they had to change but that study, I think, went through a little bit in a modified form. They changed some of the regulations on how they were using like AT4s. And other things.
And I think that was the special operations guys were the ones who kept pushing with it.
They kept on claiming that, oh no, it's safe to fire indoors in a building, and then the study says no, you get the overpressure like we told you 30 years ago with it. It's gonna smush your brain into the back of your skull.
Yeah, I mean, there's all it's these inconvenient and uncomfortable truths that that makes it very difficult for institutions to continue going along. And I mean, not like our Congress is going to do anything. Not like there's actually be any oversight, right? And they're actually going to do something. But
there could be if we could put enough pressure on them, but it's not going to happen for a while. I mean, we don't have enough independent senators like you were going for in North Carolina. Sorry about your loss.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, it's interesting. We'll see with this, what just happened with the concessions that McCarthy made to become speaker. One of those is basically a budget freeze, if I read that correctly. And of course, the thing is going to be how much Department of Defense spending is going to be frozen at. You're talking tens and tens of billions of dollars, and how that's really going to upset a lot of members of Congress. That's not the fact that any social spending or anything else that people might actually utilize and need, but the defense spending.
I'm dubious about any defense spending really getting frozen.
Well, I mean, we remember the sequestration under the Obama administration.
Yeah.
And the Pentagon got around that. I think it was Bob Gates who said that the Pentagon never lost any money. It was all balanced out through they used their what's called OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations, basically as a slush fund. and because that was exempt from, and that's how you would see it here. So if say you did get that reduction, that Pentagon spending had to drop back to FY21 levels, and I think that's about 75 billion, $80 billion less than what it is now. They would make that up by putting that 75, 80 billion, 100 billion, whatever they want to advance it to, into some type of thing for Ukraine, for Taiwan. There's a guy out there, a guy named Stephen Semler. He does great work with the Security Policy Reform Institute. And Stephen does a really good job putting the numbers together, and it's like what we know. I mean, bulk of this money, 40, 50% of the money goes to contractors. We know that with the Pentagon base budget, half the money goes to contractors. And so they're going to get their cut, whether it's earmarked for the Pentagon, whether it's earmarked for Ukraine or Taiwan. Lockheed and Raytheon are going to get their money.
The other big problem is with the Defense Department is that all those contractors have put all their businesses in every state. Yeah. Every state's got somebody that gets something, right?
Yeah.
It's a nut, a bolt, a screw, whatever. Somebody's got a contract there, and are you really going to say that I'm going to kill these 2,000, 20,000? And no, none of the senators are going to do that. So they're going to, move it around and put it over in some other fund where they can access it still.
Right. And there's that. I mean, you got to give these guys credit where credit's due. It's brilliant. Yeah, it's brilliant. And there's evidence to suggest that they target certain members of Congress.
Oh yeah.
So they know, like, this guy is a libertarian. This guy is a progressive Democrat. Let's put this in her district. This we're going to buy the tires for the F-35 from Barbara Lee's district. Right. In this way. And I don't know where Barbara Lee is on the F-35, but just in that type of idea of targeting members to make it very difficult. And I can tell you, members, a guy like Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, who really good on anti-war stuff over the years, on certain budget issues, he had problems because they made like the cotter pin that went into something, for whatever in his district. And you saw this with Bernie Sanders as well, right? Oh, yeah. Where they based the F-35, the Vermont Air National Guard was one of the first squadrons, I believe, in the country to get the F-35. And that had a lot to do with having Sanders be, if not for the F-35, complicit with it, not opposing it, not blocking it.
Yeah, you don't want to look like you're not giving the Air National Guard its top choice in aircraft. Although, unfortunately, that piece of junk deserves to be put away.
Oh, it's terrible. It's been that way for the better part of 2 decades.
Starting with the F-22 project and just, I don't know how, if the F-22 didn't work at its complexity level, what makes you think you're going to make it work better now with twice as complex?
You know what? I think that they did, again, another brilliant move, kind of similar to manufacturing everywhere, where the F-22, they wouldn't export it, right?
Right, yeah.
The F-35 they learned from that, and they made export of the F-35 a key part of the F-35 program, so that you're spreading that junk all around and you can't cancel it because there's just too much involved. There's too much money involved. There's too much, you can't. And how would it look if the United States, if after, the Koreans or, the Israelis or whoever, they had to stop using these planes you can't have that happen. You can't, that look too bad. So you just keep the program going. And again, and all the money that's involved and everything else sustains it. Yeah, it's criminal, but it's masterful.
It is. But that's not the only Lockheed project plane that was a problematic one. Even in the past, the F-104 they had problems with, but they did the similar thing. They sold it to NATO, and NATO held them together for years with that project. And that's what they're doing now. Why is Norway buying it? You can see the plane doesn't work. Why buy it?
And there are other options for aircraft out there. I mean, there are, right?
The Saab Gripen is just as good. The French Rafale is just as good.
And then
it doesn't have the stealth supposedly, but who cares? It doesn't seem to work.
You look at the Chinese and the Russian aviation markets, the planes that they're putting out like all levels of different fighters, right? Having like different entry points for different nations so that you don't have to buy the most expensive, the newest, was it Su-35, whatever, you can buy a modified MiG-29 for a lot less. I mean, the way that they've diversified their weapons markets, which is really dangerous, of course. I mean, that's not what we want to see. I mean, you hear this talking from a guy like Larry Wilkerson, someone who I really listen to quite a bit. And, Larry will say that, the Chinese have their own military industrial complex.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
right. And that's not a good thing. That's a very, very bad thing. They didn't 20 years ago, not so much. But what do you think the consequences are going to be when you keep driving American aircraft carriers off their coast, humiliating them? That gives all that gives all the ability to the Chinese hardliners to build out their military. And now they got a military industrial complex that is now competing on the world stage with offering, whoever, Iran, I think, just purchased new airplanes. I think they purchased Russians. Yeah. But offering all kinds of nations.
Part of their deal was Su-30s.
Were they? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But you've just made a bad situation with militarism around the world worse, right? And rather than trying to draw in and decrease the world arms market, you've expanded it exponentially in some ways, because where you could have had this point 30 years ago with a contraction in it, no, you've just, and because of, I believe, U.S. policies, particularly trade policies and everything else, you've made it possible, it made it the incentive there for the Russians and Chinese to really go after things. And that's one of the reasons why we were talking before, I think, about how the Russians have such depth in terms of their industrial capacity. Well, anyone who's been following the war in Ukraine knows every month there's an article in Newsweek or the Washington Post or wherever saying how the Russians are going to run out of missiles. I just saw another one the other day.
Yeah, I saw that too.
Right? They're not running out of missiles. They're not, they haven't, they're not going to. They obviously had their act together in terms of, building out their capacity to conduct this war. That's the interesting thing. If people were gaga about Angela Merkel a couple of weeks ago saying that Minsk II wasn't a real peace plan. It was just the opportunity to build out Ukrainian weapons and military and prepare for war. The Russians did the same thing as well. So this idea that somehow the Russians were not going to prepare for this, but we were, it's just stupid. Yeah.
Apparently they did a little better than we anticipated.
Right. And for everything I can see, Connor, it's like that anticipation was not there. No. That somehow we thought, for whatever the U.S. government and the Brits, and we thought that the Russians were just going to kind of twiddle their thumbs. We're gonna stage a coup, and then we're gonna, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you did Crimea, and you did this whole thing in the Donbass, but you're not gonna do anything more. We're not worried about that. So this nuts. Yeah.
Well, I also think the Russians also over anticipated our response this time, because they thought the Crimea was going to go just like what they did here. They were going to roll in pretty much and have no resistance.
Yeah.
This time we gave them a hell of a lot more weapons than they ever anticipated.
Right. It's certainly effective weapons. It's the use of, from what I can understand, the javelins. Yeah, exactly. The javelins, the stingers to a degree, right? The ability to have a weapon, a technology that has an impact on the tactics and operations of your opponent is really something. We get spun up a lot about weapons this, weapons that, the nerdy details of it. But occasionally you do have a weapon that can have an impact tactically and operationally that changes your adversary's ability to conduct its operations. And I think you've seen that with some of those things. At the same time, too, I think we have a misunderstanding of the Russian purposes in their invasion. I think you have many American leaders and British leaders who really do believe that the Russians wanted to conquer all of Ukraine. And I don't think that was ever, I'm in the camp that doesn't believe they ever want to do that they realized it was not possible, that was not winnable, not something. Why would we want to get into a war of occupation, first of all? It's just too difficult right? And really the idea was my kind of view of it, and others say this as well too, is that your move on Kyiv in February was a feint or a demonstration in order to basically put your hand around their throat, force them to negotiations, and try and get that way. And then when that didn't happen, we're just going to take the East and hold it. So, that's where I think they're. But I don't think. I think I've got a minority view on that among U.S. Among U.S. foreign policy people. I think many people do believe that the entire conquest of Ukraine was the Russian goal, which I think is not borne out by evidence, but also doesn't make any sense because I don't know how it could have been possible.
I think they were going for more regime change, actually, myself, with that first move. They were going to cut Kyiv off, change the regime, put a friendly regime in, and then, by de facto have control over it like they do in Belarus.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
I mean, that's certainly possible. Yeah. I think with the playing out of how
I just can't believe that first pincher movement didn't stall so terribly for them. I don't understand that.
It's possible they didn't want to enter Kyiv. It's possible. I mean, it's possible they stalled. It's possible they got held up. Resistance was much better than they anticipated. Right? As you were saying, they underestimated it. But it's possible they didn't want to enter. If they had entered, then they would have owned it. And then once, right? I mean, it's similar to what happened a year and a half ago in Afghanistan, where you had the Taliban saying to the Americans, in August of 2021, as the Taliban were on the outskirts of Kabul, we don't want to take it. We're not prepared for this. We're not ready for it. Can you guys hold it until we're ready to take it? This is what the Taliban said to the United States in August 2021. So you could see that where I think maybe the Russians felt that way as well, too. And then who knows if they had something already queued up with the Turks, because those talks between the Turks, between the Ukrainians and the Russians that the Turks facilitated, those happened pretty quickly. So I don't know if there was, that's kind of why I think it was more of that type of force the Ukrainians, get them to the table, get quick concessions from them, maybe something that looked like Minsk II with an autonomous zone there, declaration of neutrality. The Ukrainians say, no, we're giving up on NATO. We're not going to mess around with Crimea ever again. That belongs to you, by threatening Kyiv that way. As well as it forced the Ukrainians, right, to turn their backs to Eastern Ukraine. I mean, you've got this because you can't diminish the size of that Russian thrust on Kyiv. It was big, and it was meaningful. So what you did then was pull the Ukrainian attention back towards Kyiv. So basically you got the Ukrainians in Eastern Ukrainian army having to redirect to possibly save their capital. That allows you then to go into the Donbass with less resistance than you may have been hit with earlier. So, I mean, I think but we won't know until they tell us. That's the reality of it. We won't know until they tell us what they were thinking.
And then we even won't know because they're going to tell the best story they want to tell.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So 30 years from now, when somebody finally declassifies it, we'll find out what really happened.
That's right. There'll be who knows what will happen, and the vault of the Kremlin will be opened, and I'm
surprised Belarus hasn't gotten involved yet.
I don't. My thoughts on that is maybe the Belarusians are just not capable of doing anything. That's such a poor kind of broken down economic system they have there that they may have an army on paper of whatever. But the reality is they have no combat capable units, that they would just be more problems than I don't know. And then maybe on the Russian perspective is that if we just keep this strictly between Russia and Ukraine, that doesn't allow for anyone else to be involved. We've been Belarus in, and now you're giving into the argument that NATO has to be more involved.
I think that's more of it myself, is that they're too afraid that NATO will have that Poland and Lithuania especially, since they're the closest.
And they're aggressive too. They've got, and for good reason. They've been occupied and conquered by Russia. There's a lot of history here.
Germany.
Right? Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of history that you look at the psychology and you say, okay, I can understand why the Poles are so aggressive with this, and I got that to a degree, I don't agree with it, but I understand why their angst and their anger is up. but yeah, certainly, you know, and I don't really understand the Russian decision making enough in the sense of their structure and how much Putin makes decisions on his own and how much is done through kind of a more institutional setting. I think certainly he's not Lyndon Johnson, Henry Kissinger picking out targets on a map. I don't think that's at all. But I get the feeling that it's a pretty small circle around him, if there is a circle, you know.
I would like to see what the actual command structure looks like. I mean, some of the reports have it that it's very fractured.
Yeah.
That each general is basically fighting his own war or not fighting his own war in some cases, just holding his troops in reserves. I mean, there doesn't seem to be one unified commander like we had during World War II with Eisenhower, who's delegating targets, picking out the overall strategy and making it happen.
Yeah, and that's what's
weird.
Weird, and exactly, and because the Russians seem to have done some things very well, as we were talking about their industrial base, the depth of that, their you know, they're running logistic problems like the Ukrainians are, but I think that's to be expected in warfare. We'll see as this next year goes on. I think you know, and they settle into, I think, a real stalemate. I think as that continues.
Oh, good. That means we get another book from Malcolm Nance again at the front.
Oh God. You know, it's just so hard to just, as we said before.
He blocked me on Twitter because I said he was a fraud because he posted. I mean, what guy on the front line is posting pictures of himself on Twitter every day?
Malcolm Nance's, you know, yeah, well, and he's got how many 100,000 followers or a million?
To me,
followers.
That proves that you're in the rear with the gear because you're not using. No one's giving away your position like that. I mean,
that's exactly right. That's the understanding I had. That seems to be the case with where the Ukrainians killed those Russian conscripts last week or whenever it was.
Don't use your cell phone.
Don't use your cell phone.
You can triangulate it from the towers and the satellites and figure out where.
It's a very dangerous war.
And certainly don't put a picture of where you are and send that so that they can decrypt it and find out. Oh, well, that's where the base is.
Well, that was an issue we had even in
Iraq.
Even in 06 with MySpace, you know, I mean, the kids would go into the computer. We didn't have any Wi-Fi or anything like that. I didn't have cell phones that worked over there. Then now it's completely different, of course. Yeah. But then they would go to the Marines. You'd have whatever fob you're on, depending upon the size. There'd be like a computer room, morale, welfare, and recreation would bring in these computers, and they barely worked or whatever. But you'd see the Marines in there on MySpace pages, you know, and like, you know, don't post, you know. But I
had a buddy who got in serious trouble for posting himself on when he was deployed. It used to be a big thing.
Well, the first time I ever saw it actually happen, where this was a real issue, was I had been in Baghdad for early May of 2004. And I can't remember if there were rockets or mortars struck the palace that we were in, where CPA headquarters, what became the embassy. A rocket or a mortar hit the embassy. And I remember, like, within a couple hours, emails from Washington, D.C. had come back to me with photos of that. Right. And so that actually is a very real concern in the sense of you now just given the enemy battle damage assessment. Right. You let them know that it hit they're going to know that from news reports anyway, but you're able to see where it hit and how much.
But you can control the news report. You can't control this.
You can't control this at all. No, I mean, like, and
that's what I thought was so. That's what I thought was so funny about Malcolm Nance sending out all these photos of himself. I'm like, what are you doing? I mean, you've got to be in a hotel somewhere hiding out because no one in the front line would let the intel officer to post pictures of himself every day.
Yeah, I don't.
And tweet.
I don't. You know, it's so, as we were saying before about trying to find out information about this war, how difficult it is. You know, one of the things to do is just ignore people like that because you're not going to get anything of value from them. All you're going to get from them is just their own self-perpetuating, self-aggrandizing nonsense, plus the propaganda. And the Russian side is you know, just as bad. I mean, the stuff that the Russian bloggers and everything else put out is just as ridiculous as the stuff that the Western side puts out. So that's why I say you got to find that. Yeah.
But
I don't know. Oh, go ahead.
I think that's going to be the most interesting thing to study about this war at the end is how it played out online. It's going to be
Yeah.
the first real war that played out over Twitter, with each side trying to tweet the most viral tweet of the enemy.
Right, right. You know, it's inane, and of course, you know, it's denuding us. It's removing us from the actual suffering that's occurring, right? From the horror that this
Yeah.
war is. I mean, war is organized murder, and that's what's occurring there. Uh, you know, I mean, I gotta imagine that there are probably a handful of officers on either side that have a good holistic understanding of what's occurring in this war. I mean, the numbers are probably startlingly few of Ukrainian and Russian officers who could tell you with a degree of certainty what the war is like, what's happening, what the status is, where they think it's going to go. The others are so either so ideological,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or they don't have a clear picture or a full picture. And that's what you worry about with your leadership. You know, you worry about that with Zelensky, you worry about it with Putin, you know, certainly with Biden. What information are they getting? You know, when I resigned in protest from the war in Afghanistan, and I came back, and Washington Post ran a story on me and everything else, and I ended up having to go talking to a lot of people in Washington D.C. And one of them was Chuck Hagel, and this is before he became Secretary of Defense under Obama. At that point, him along with David Boren were the co-chairs of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, the PM.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I had to do, I had to go in and basically give evidence, testify, because both Hagel and Boren wanted to know how come the things that you're saying, and that we hear. Hagel was at Georgetown and Boren was the president of the University of Oklahoma. How come the things that we're hearing from you and from every military officer that comes through our classes are not ending up on the president's desk? We see what the president reads about Afghanistan, and what you're saying is nowhere close to what the president is receiving. And it would be okay if you're just some crackpot who's just spouting off stuff. But no, what you're saying matches up with what all these majors and colonels and, you know, commanders and everything else who are coming through our classrooms are also saying about the war. So that's a very real concern is what type of information are the, you know, what does Lavrov and Putin get? What does Zelensky get? What kind of, I mean, I can tell you that the crap that Blinken is getting, that Austin is getting, that, you know, and this goes back to my favorite Eisenhower quote. You know, people quote him military industrial complex and everything else, but with Eisenhower, my favorite quote of him was as related by his daughter. Suppose he was standing in the Oval Office and he pointed at his chair and he says, "I rue the day that this country has a man sit in that chair who doesn't understand the military like I do." And he wasn't talking about like, you got to have a guy who, you know, understands strategy or logistics or anything like that. What he was talking about was the fact that you got to have someone who understands that the generals lie all the time, and they will always lie all the time. You know, I mean, that's what bothers me and concerns me is like, what is Biden being told about this that is just completely far-fetched, nonsensical, just meant to move the narrative along, on and on and on.
Well, now you also have not only the generals line, but now you have the generals are now part of the consultant class.
Right.
So you got a double whammy there. So after they get out of their general position, they go into the consultant job. They get back into the Pentagon, and now they want to sell you all these new weapons and new strategies and tell you how great this is going to be. We're going to win the war by Christmas if we just do this, this, and this, and it doesn't happen.
A number of years ago, about 10 years ago, I was told by the military officer who was a part of Senator Bob Casey's staff. You know, so people don't know, every office in the Congress that wants a military officer assigned to their office can have one. And so the vast majority of I think the vast majority, I don't know what the actual count is, but, you know, there's a lot of military officers in the Congress, and they don't work for the member. They work for the Secretary of Defense, right? So brilliant move on the part of the Pentagon to do this. But I remember this major told me that he was very upset about this, that in case he was on the Foreign Relations Committee, that 7 out of 10 briefings that the Foreign Relations Committee got, the Armed Services Committee got, came from think tanks. right? So, 7 out of 10 briefings on the Iraq War, the Afghan War, the war in Syria, what have you, came not from the American CIA, from the State Department, from the Pentagon, but came from think tanks, right? So you have that type of the thumb is definitely on the scale, right? And the circular aspects of the funding, of course, the Congress appropriates $876 billion this year for the Pentagon. We know half of that will go to the defense contractors. Of that, a portion will go back into campaign for the members of Congress, but a portion also goes to fund these think tanks. And these are the people who then go in and provide the briefings for the members of Congress. I mean, I went in St. Pat. It was the day after St. Patrick's Day, 2010. I went in to brief Ike Skelton on the Afghan War, and this was the surge in Afghanistan was underway. Operation Mashtarak, the conquest of Marja, if people remember that, was underway as the proof of context, all the government in a box, all that nonsense people remember from 12 years ago, and 13 years ago now, actually, I guess. And so Skelton was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Like, there's no one higher in the Congress in terms of dealing with the issues of war than Chairman Skelton. He says to me, as we're sitting there in his office, "You're the first person to ever come in here and tell me something negative about the war in Afghanistan." Right?
It's because you weren't selling it.
That's exactly right. And you sit there and you say, how is this possible? How is this absolutely possible that almost 9 years into this war, 8.5 years into this war, and with everything that's been going on and with the Iraq War and everything else, that you, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, has told me you've never received a negative briefing on the war in Afghanistan? Even when General McChrystal just put out a big high-profile report 6 months ago saying how we need to send 80,000 more troops or else the war in Afghanistan is lost. Obviously that didn't even make it to you. And that was
maybe he didn't sell it negatively. Maybe he sold it as a positive.
I guess there's opportunity.
We're doing good. We're doing well, but we could do a little better with 80,000.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and I had, those years, he was doing a lot of lobbying and had a lot of access. I don't think I would have that now. Things have changed, but that wasn't uncommon, I mean, to have an interaction with that. I think it was because he was the chair of the HASC, but, I tell whole stories about whether it was Jack Reed or Adam Smith or, people that were very important, in terms of the Congress and the wars, who just were either disengaged or didn't have the courage to do anything.
Well, I think a lot of it has to go back to that old saying. You can't, what was it, Upton Sinclair, who said that, when a man's salary depends on not understanding something, it's amazing how well he does that.
Yeah.
I mean, your lobbyist isn't going to pay you to understand that they're selling you a false narrative about the war, so you have to just, I guess I believe him.
Right.
That's where the checks come through.
Yeah. I mean, and then you add in there's all kinds of aspects of this, right? You add the media aspect into it, the access journalism aspect of it. Well, if we report negatively, then Raditz isn't going to get on a helicopter ride with David Petraeus.
That's a huge problem right now in media, the access nature of it.
It is.
With so many sources now that you can just go to, you could just find anybody pretty much.
That's right.
And just say, well, if you're going to give me a bad interview, I'm going to go to this guy instead.
That's exactly right, Connor. Exactly. Like that's a consequence of the technologies, of the internet, of what have you. There is so much available that, the Pentagon doesn't need you, ABC. Nope. We can tell our story to whoever.
OAN, who's going to be more friendly anyway.
Hey, I a number of years ago, I was on, when was that? Like 2015. I was on One American News Network a couple of times with, of all people, I don't know where she is these days, but do you remember Tommy Lauren?
Yeah, I remember Tommy.
Yeah, I was on with her. Probably was 2015 when
that had to be a painful interview.
No, it was amazing. It was a great interview. And I was on with her a couple of times. And I'll tell you what happened was, so I think it was the first year, One American News Network. People don't know it was actually started by AT&T was involved with
Yes.
it, right? It to provide a more conservative media choice because Fox wasn't conservative enough. And but I was doing a lot of media work at that point through my think tank, and you'd send out you pitch yourself or whatever, and then you write. I used to write a lot for the Huffington Post as well, and so it'd be you get a producer would contact you. You want to come on? Never heard of these people before. I go on. Here's this young journalist. I mean, she was right out of journalism school. She was fantastic. She would send me her questions, but I probably was on 3 times with her. She'd send me her questions beforehand. She was very professional, very polite. She listened to what I said and would respond. I mean, just wow, you're fantastic. You're great.
That's a huge shock from what she turned herself into.
Exactly.
To make money.
Then I don't know, not very long after that.
Then she got hooked up with the guy Charlie Kirk over.
She got hooked up with Charlie Kirk, and I think it was the summer of whenever the CPAC was for the 2016 election. So probably about a year after I was on the TV with her. She went to CPAC and she made, I remember one of the things she did was she made a comment about Hillary Clinton in pantsuits. Oh, yeah. And that just went bananas. I mean, that just went, I mean, and she saw her audience.
Yep.
And that's where she went. And she had that celebrity from that moment. And then she just doubled down on that type of, I'm going to be this type of journalist, this type of vitriol. And I think the network as well was moving in that direction too. But yeah, I mean, that was my experience, at least, those 2 or 3 times with her, was that she was terrific. But
that's amazing. I mean, but she should go back to that. I mean, but there's unfortunately, they've killed that kind of reporting.
It was, and it was, I remember the program, whatever program I was on, maybe she had an hour-long program, and she would do kind of a news thing, 15 minutes, and then do 10, 12, 15-minute segments with 2 or 3 people, right? Yeah. So it was kind of more of a prolonged, in-depth interview. Yeah. And very professional, very well done. And then a year later, she's, turned into, a
raving lunatic.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And, a lot of it you look at it and you wonder. I met Ann Coulter one time, worked with her actually. Work I was doing, we were doing is anti-Afghan war stuff, and we wanted to bring in people from all perspectives, and we had this event, and we got Ann Coulter wanted to do it. So we got Ann Coulter. She was lovely. She was delightful, very intelligent. Completely different person than when she got up behind the microphone, where she became,
Ann Coulter.
Blood, yeah, exactly. Blood dripping out of her mouth, kind of thing. But
I've heard that there's distinctly like a switch she flips on when she goes on camera.
That was what it was like. It was as if she went up there and someone went behind and pulled the string, and started her up. It was amazing, and it was a seamless transformation. I mean, and then when she came off, it was like, wow. You're back to the person I went to dinner with the other night, this is crazy. How can you live with yourself like this? But they do.
I guess when you see the paycheck.
I guess that's what it is, right? Yeah. Yeah. A lot of it.
You see that. Oh, wow, that's working.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's, I've never really thought of her too much, I mean, with her rabid takes on everything that she presents, it just sounds crazy.
Yeah. I've seen it happen. Others too. People are familiar with Tony Schaefer. He was on Fox News quite a bit, and he, former defense intelligence guy. I used to do a lot of media with him, again, opposing the Afghan war. And he was very reasonable. Obviously came from a Republican conservative background, very reasonable, great guy. We used to take the train up to New York all the time to be on MSNBC together, right? Terrific guy. And then he found a niche at Fox. And very much became anti-Obama and very much, anti-government, and the IRS is coming to get you, and, just like all types of because he got that celebrity and the attention. And, I'll say as well, I mean, a number of people I know like this, it's, I knew Tom Cotton in Afghanistan, and he is not the Tom Cotton I knew in Afghanistan, and also did media with him as well before he ran for Congress. He was, if you said, here's a guy, he's a Harvard lawyer, became an Army infantry officer, this is a quiet spoken, confident, smart guy, very nice guy. And then he runs for Congress and he's this a fire breathing troglodyte who just got out of the cave, I mean, and it's effective though.
It is. Right? And that's the scary part, is how effective it is. And that kind of brings us back to our first part about how effective the paramilitarization of the right is becoming. I mean, it's becoming more and more effective, really. That kind of rhetoric, the uniforms even. I mean, that's like, it's one part dress up and one part, reality for them.
Oh, exactly. And I think it's in that the part that's reality is growing, right? How long, Connor, till we get we see open displays of those things at political rallies, right?
Well, we saw it in Arizona. I mean, they were openly carrying guns at the drop boxes for votes this year.
Well, yeah. What I'm talking about too is like, how long do we get till we have a Lauren Boebert or someone like that is giving a speech, and there's a paramilitary contingent lined up listening to her,
like
right?
The Triumph of Will.
What's that?
Like the film, The Triumph of Will.
Yeah. Just there's a squad of Proud Boys, in their uniforms, lined up in formation, ready to take orders. Right? Not there, not present, but like formally part of the rally. This is our armed paramilitary wing of the Republican Party. How long until we see that? I think that we might see that in this next election cycle. I don't know.
I do. I think we will see that very soon. I think that's where it's going. The dress up part's fading away. The reality is moving up, and it's because most of the people they have are former military. They're very motivated, very organized, very trained, and they have nowhere to go, and they see everything slipping away.
Yeah, exactly. That's the big thing for me. They feel like they're running out of time. They feel like they're losing. They feel like they're being encroached upon. It's now or never kind of thing. Yeah.
And I think that's where they're going to go. And I think that's problematic for all of us.
It's incredibly dangerous. I mean, anyone, the escalation of violence, and it's just the way violence is uncontrollable. The consequences are unknowable. And then how that is exponential. It's not a linear increase. It's like an exponential increase in these conflicts, in these civil wars and what have you, where it very quickly blows open, and everything. It's like those wildfires you hear about, right? That just spread at a rate that it's how you couldn't comprehend it. And I think that's what we can learn from, people in the former Yugoslavia, people in Iraq. I mean, the Iraqis I know that talk to about how that civil war just, it wasn't. They had dealt with the war before. They had dealt with the Iran-Iraq war. They had dealt with Iranian missiles falling down and being bombed by the Iranians. They had been bombed by the American Air Force and Navy all throughout the 90s, and the sanctions and everything else. And then, of course, dealing with the Ba'ath Party and the secret police and all that. But they had no conception that a civil war was going to occur between them and their neighbors. They didn't.
True. Yeah. But they also didn't have a power vacuum like they had after we went in and removed the Ba'ath Party. And we're getting a power vacuum in a sense by having so many stagnating policies that just never happen for the people that need real political change and aren't seeing it.
Yeah, no, I know exactly. They, my buddy, and I need to wrap up, but my buddy sent me a text the other day, and this is after all on the tail as we see more government involvement in social media censorship, right? And as he said, this is when you think about it, this is really great make work for low caliber staff, right? Don't worry yourself about finding solutions to a pandemic, to recession, to overseas wars. Just stop people from talking about it.
Yeah, it is. It's brilliant, and vilify those that do.
That's right, right. You know, if you have any put up any type of questioning, honest
Mhm.
questioning, you
Mhm.
get shut down. And there's a lot of nonsense and
Oh,
misinformation
sure.
and people trying to stir the pot for malicious reasons. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of greed involved in this, and everything else. But there's also too a lot of people with honest questions who have been shut down, who then because of that type of censorship,
Mhm.
where do they go? You
And,
know,
well, they go to more extreme forms
right.
of the internet entertainment entertainment session, and then they end up in
Right.
Idaho with a militia.
That's exactly right. Well, that's exactly right. All because
Uh,
they had legitimate concerns about something that they
mhm,
didn't understand, and they're told that they're a conspiracy theorist, that they
mhm.
are whatever, and yeah, yeah.
And I think with that, we're going to have to wrap it up. I know you have things to do, and it was great having you again, Matt. And I
Yeah,
hope
anytime, Connor. I
to
really
have
enjoyed
you
it.
again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And thanks, everyone. This is the end of our broadcast.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for watching, and happy new year. And